52 tanks destroyed, 0 lost. The Battle of Medenine, fought on March 6, 1943, was the ambush that ended Rommel's Afrika Korps forever. Nearly 470 anti-tank guns were hidden in the Tunisian desert, laid out across miles of carefully bulldozed positions. And not a single British tank fired a single offensive shot. The German panzers never knew what hit them. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man who had outmaneuvered and outwitted British commanders across 1,400 miles of North African desert, walked into a trap so perfectly constructed that he left Africa 3 days later and never came back. This is that story. To understand what the Battle of Medenine meant, you have to understand how desperate Rommel's position was before the first shot was fired. On November 4, 1942, following 12 days of brutal combat at El Alamein in Egypt, General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army broke through the Axis line. Rommel's forces began a retreat that would cover 1,400 miles in just over 3 months. 1,400 miles, the distance from London to Moscow. The retreating Army Group Africa abandoned Libya entirely. On February 15, 1943, the last Axis soldier crossed out of Libya into Tunisia. Every piece of territory the Afrika Korps had seized, fought for, bled for across 2 years of desert warfare, gone. Rommel's command had also shrunk in ways that mattered far beyond raw numbers. German supply lines to North Africa had been strangled. The Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force were destroying Axis shipping at a rate that made meaningful resupply nearly impossible. Rommel himself was physically ill, jaundice and low blood pressure, and had been begging Berlin and Rome for permission to withdraw entirely from Africa, to preserve what remained of Army Group Africa for the defense of Europe. Berlin said no. Then, on February 19, 1943, Rommel achieved one final moment of genuine brilliance. At the Kasserine Pass in western Tunisia, Rommel's forces fell on green American troops under Major General Lloyd Fredendall and destroyed them. American equipment was captured, American units routed. It was Rommel at his most dangerous, outnumbered, undersupplied, but tactically lethal. Kasserine Pass was Rommel's last victory, and it made what was about to happen at the Battle of Medenine all the more devastating. After Kasserine, Rommel's attention shifted south. Montgomery's 8th Army was assembling near a small Tunisian town called Medenine, preparing to assault the Mareth line, a series of French-built fortifications from the 1930s anchored along the Wadi Zigzag, a natural anti-tank obstacle with embankments up to 70 feet high. Rommel understood that if Montgomery broke through the Mareth line, the entire Axis position in Tunisia would be flanked. Army Group Africa, already trapped between Montgomery to the south and Anglo-American forces to the west and north, would be finished. The Abai's strategic logic, therefore, pointed toward one option: attack Montgomery before the 8th Army launched its own assault. On February 28, 1943, 6 days before the battle, Rommel convened a planning conference. The objective: strike the British concentration at Medenine, disrupt the buildup, and buy time. Rommel proposed a bold, indirect approach, a pincer movement along the coast, attacking from an unexpected direction. His subordinates refused. The coastal route was covered by dense minefields, they argued. British guns were everywhere. So Rommel was overruled. The final plan, drawn up by General Giovanni Messi, commanding the Italian First Army, and Lieutenant General Heinz Ziegler of the Afrika Korps, called for a three-pronged frontal assault. 3 panzer divisions, roughly 160 to 200 tanks. Infantry of the 90th Light Division, the 164th Light Division, and the Italian Spezia Division, all attacking from the Matmata Hills and the Haluf Pass, converging on the Awa. British position from 3 directions simultaneously. It looked on paper like a plan. What Rommel's staff didn't know, What no one in Axis command could know was that Montgomery already knew every detail. The Battle of Medenine cannot be understood without understanding Ultra. Since 1940, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire had been reading German Enigma-encoded communications, the messages the German military believed were completely unbreakable. The intelligence product was called Ultra, and it was the most closely guarded secret of the entire war. By early 1943, Ultra was operating at a level of speed and precision that bordered on the extraordinary. At 5:36 a.m. on March 6, 1943, 24 minutes before the German attack began at 6 a.m., Ultra codebreakers transmitted to Montgomery the precise details of Rommel's assault. The timing, the direction, the units involved. 24 minutes. But here is what makes the Battle of Medenine even more remarkable. Montgomery didn't need the last-minute warning. Rommel's plan had been readable in Ultra intercepts for days. The Eighth Army had been reinforcing the Medenine position since approximately March 1st. By the time Rommel's panzers rolled forward at dawn on March 6th, Montgomery had been expecting them for nearly a week. Montgomery's own admission, recorded in his personal account, was that he had been genuinely exposed before reinforcements arrived. Between February 28th and March 3rd, Montgomery wrote, he was definitely unbalanced. His X-Corps was still 1,000 miles away in Benghazi. Only 2 divisions stood between Rommel and a potentially war-altering victory. But the reinforcements came. General Bernard Freyberg's 2nd New Zealand Division was rushed up from Tripoli. The 7th Armored Division moved into position. The 51st Highland Division dug in, and the anti-tank gunners arrived, by the hundreds. By March 4th, Montgomery had assembled 400 tanks, 350 field guns, and 470 anti-tank guns. Among those weapons were captured German 88mm guns, the finest anti-tank weapon in either army's arsenal, now pointed back at the army that had built them. The Battle of Medenine was won before it was fought. Over the 10 days before March 6th, British engineers with bulldozers carved gun pits out of the Tunisian desert, hundreds of them, positioned along a defensive line stretching across every approach to Medenine. The anti-tank guns were lowered into these pits, camouflaged and hidden. An aerial observer flying over the British position would have seen nothing unusual. The guns were invisible. Montgomery's tactical concept was built on a single, counterintuitive idea. British tanks would not fight. The 400 tanks assembled at Medenine would be held in reserve, kept completely out of the battle. This was deliberate. Montgomery needed those tanks for the Mareth line assault to come. There was no intention of risking them against Rommel's panzers on March 6th. Instead, German armor would be destroyed by guns the German commanders couldn't see, firing from positions they hadn't mapped, at ranges too close for any effective countermaneuver. The plan required patience. Gunners were ordered to hold fire until the German panzers had advanced to point-blank range, to wait until the kill was certain. This is what 470 anti-tank guns, perfectly positioned, perfectly hidden, with perfect foreknowledge of the attack, looks like in practice. It looks like a massacre. At 6 o'clock in the morning on March 6, 1943, Rommel's forces moved forward under a cover of fog and rain. The 10th Panzer Division drove toward the village of Metamur. The 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions advanced across open desert toward Tajera Kbir and the Haluf sector. Infantry screened the tanks. Artillery prepared to follow. For the first hour, the German panzers advanced with confidence. The British line seemed thin. The fog helped. And then the anti-tank guns opened fire. By 8:30 in the morning, just 2.5 hours after the assault began, half of the Panzer III tanks attacking Tajera Kbir had been destroyed. That sector's advance stopped. The surviving tanks did not retreat in good order. They broke. By 10 o'clock, Rommel's advance had stalled on all three prongs simultaneously. The fog had lifted. Every German tank that pushed forward was being tracked by gunners in concealed pits who had been waiting calmly for exactly this moment. General Hans Kramer, who had taken command of the Afrika Korps only the day before, on March 5th, reported to Rommel by noon. The tanks were at a standstill. British guns were everywhere. Targets couldn't be identified. The Eighth Army was not engaging with its armor at all, which made no sense to German tactical doctrine. Something was wrong. Rommel initially suspected Italian officers had betrayed the plan. Rommel never knew it was ultra. Noon, Rommel assessed the situation as hopeless. But the Desert Fox was not a man who accepted hopeless without another attempt. At 2:30 in the afternoon, a second assault was launched. This time, infantry led the tanks, the thinking being that infantry could identify and silence British gun positions before the armor moved in. The British artillery responded with what Highlanders from the 51st Division later described as a wonderful shoot. German soldiers, one witness reported, were dropping like 9 pins. The second assault collapsed as completely as the first. There was one moment in the battle, a small detail that rarely appears in mainstream accounts, that captures just how thoroughly the British had prepared. Troops of the 21st Panzer Division, advancing across open desert 5 miles west of Medenine, encountered rows of objects laid out across the ground ahead of them. Empty bully beef tins. British Army food cans, arranged in neat rows to simulate a minefield. The panzer commanders, unable to confirm the obstacle wasn't real, ordered their tanks to swerve around the tin cans. The swerve exposed the panzer's thinner side armor. Concealed anti-tank guns, waiting precisely for this moment, opened fire. A dozen tanks caught fire within minutes. Empty food tins. 12 German tanks. At dusk, Rommel called off the entire operation. The mathematics of the Battle of Medenine are stark. Axis losses: 52 tanks destroyed, more than 1/3 of Rommel's total armor commitment, gone in a single day. Axis personnel casualties: approximately 635 total. 61 Germans killed, 388 wounded, 32 missing. 33 Italians killed, 122 wounded, 9 missing. Roughly 30 Axis guns lost. Allied losses: approximately 130 casualties, the majority of them minor wounds. One regiment, the 1st 5th Queens, suffered just 2 men killed. British tanks destroyed in combat: 0. Because British tanks never entered the battle at all. Rommel had come to Medenine with roughly 160 to 200 tanks. The Desert Fox left with fewer than half that number intact. Nothing had been achieved, not a yard of ground taken, not a British gun silenced, not a single day's delay imposed on Montgomery's preparations. Medenine was not a costly tactical defeat. It was an annihilation. On the morning of March 7, 1943, what remained of the Axis armored force began withdrawing northward toward the Mareth line. Rommel spent the day surveying the wreckage of his last offensive. In his own papers before the attack, Rommel had written, "An attack against the Eighth Army at Medenine was bound to be an extremely difficult undertaking. There was little chance of coming upon the enemy at any point where he would not be expecting an attack." Rommel had known. He had argued for the indirect approach. He had been overruled, and now 52 tanks were burning in the Tunisian desert. Around March 9, 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel boarded an aircraft and left Africa. The official reason was medical. Rommel had been genuinely ill for months. The leave was framed as temporary. Rommel never came back. The Desert Fox left without formally saying goodbye to his troops. He left without public announcement. The men of the Afrika Korps, many of whom had served under Rommel for 2 years, who had crossed deserts with him, who had won battles that military historians still study today, did not know their commander had gone. Rommel simply disappeared. Montgomery, watching the battle from his command post, offered two assessments that have passed into the historical record. When the first assault began, and it became clear that Rommel was attacking exactly where and when Ultra had indicated, Montgomery said, "It was an absolute gift. The man must be mad." After the second assault collapsed in the afternoon. The Marshal has made a balls of it. Behind the irreverence was something more important, genuine respect for how close Rommel had come. Montgomery's own admission, written after the war, was that between February 28th and March 3rd, the Eighth Army's commander had been definitely unbalanced. If Rommel had attacked 3 days earlier, before Freiburg's New Zealanders arrived, before the anti-tank gun line was complete, the result might have been entirely different. The Battle of Medenine was decided not just by the guns on March 6th, but by a logistics race in the 10 days before it. Montgomery won that race. The Battle of Medenine was not the final engagement in North Africa, but it was the end of any serious Axis offensive capability on the continent. In March 1943, the Battle of the Mareth line opened exactly as Montgomery had planned, with the Eighth Army breaking through the Wadi Zigzao fortifications. The Axis fell back. In April, the combined Allied forces, the Eighth Army from the south, the British First Army and American Second Corps from the west and north, tightened the noose around the final Axis bridgehead in Tunisia. By early May 1943, the perimeter had shrunk to nothing. On May 13, 1943, 68 days after the Battle of Medenine, all remaining Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered unconditionally. The total number of prisoners, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. One of the largest mass surrenders in the history of modern warfare. The Afrika Korps that Rommel had built, the force that had crossed Libya twice, that had stood at the gates of Cairo, that had made Rommel a legend, ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The Battle of Medenine is one of the most decisive engagements of the North African campaign, and one of the least remembered. There are reasons for this. The battle lasted a single day. It produced no dramatic counterattack, no heroic last stand, no iconic image. The British victory was so methodical, so complete, and so one-sided that the narrative arc most histories prefer. The hard-fought struggle against the odds simply doesn't apply. Medenine was ambush. It was execution. It was 470 hidden guns firing at surprise tanks. The battle is also overshadowed by what came immediately after: the Mareth line assault, the fall of Tunisia, the massive prisoner haul of May 1943. Larger events, within weeks, drew historians' attention. And there is one more reason Medenine sits in shadow. The ultra-secret was not declassified until the 1970s. For 30 years after the war, Medenine appeared in the historical record as a straightforward defensive victory, competent preparation, well-positioned guns, good British soldiering. It was all of those things, but it was also the product of one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in military history. Codebreakers reading Rommel's communications in real time, giving Montgomery a week's warning, letting the Desert Fox walk into a trap built specifically for him. The Battle of Medenine rewards attention from anyone interested in how wars are actually won. The first lesson is about intelligence. Field Marshal Rommel was, by every measure, one of the most gifted operational commanders of the Second World War. At Medenine, none of that mattered. The Ultra-Intelligence Program gave Montgomery information that no tactical genius could overcome. Rommel was playing a game whose outcome had already been determined by codebreakers in a country house in Buckinghamshire. Information, the right information, in the right hands, at the right time, is a force multiplier unlike any weapon. The second lesson is about patience. Montgomery made a decision in preparing the Medenine position that was genuinely counterintuitive for the era. British tanks would not fight. 400 tanks sat idle while 470 guns did the killing. Montgomery understood that the Battle of Medenine was not the decisive engagement. The Mareth line assault would be. Preserving armor for that fight meant accepting a battle in which the temptation to deploy tanks aggressively had to be consciously resisted. British commanders in earlier phases of the North African campaign had frequently dissipated armor in piecemeal attacks. Montgomery didn't. The tanks sat still. The guns fired. 52 panzers burned. The third lesson is about Rommel himself, asterisk. The Rommel mythology is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Rommel at Medenine was a man who knew the attack was probably a mistake, argued against the plan, was overruled, and launched it anyway. The result was the destruction of more than one-third of his remaining armor. Military genius has limits. When those limits collide with a prepared enemy holding superior intelligence, superior numbers, and superior material, they break. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel returned to Germany in early March 1943 and was eventually given command of Army Group B in France, tasked with preparing coastal defenses against the expected Allied invasion. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, those defenses were penetrated. In July 1944, Rommel was severely wounded when Allied aircraft attacked his staff car in Normandy. While recovering, Rommel became associated with the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. The precise degree of involvement remains debated by historians to this day. In October 1944, Hitler gave Rommel a choice: face a public trial for treason with consequences for his family, or take poison. Rommel took the poison. The Nazi state gave the Desert Fox a state funeral and declared that Germany's most famous general had died of his wounds. The men of the Afrika Korps who survived Medenine and the fall of Tunisia spent years in Allied prisoner of war camps before returning home. Many did not return home at all. The Mareth line, the fortification whose protection Rommel had been trying to guarantee at Medenine, fell to the Eighth Army within weeks of the battle. The engagement that was supposed to protect the Mareth position did not delay its fall by a single day. In the Tunisian desert on the afternoon of March 6, 1943, the last act of Rommel's African campaign ended in smoke and silence. The panzers had come out of the Matmata Hills and the Halaf Pass with 160 tanks and the confidence of an army that had crossed a continent. The panzers found 470 guns they couldn't see, in positions they hadn't mapped, already zeroed in on every line of approach. Empty bully beef tins destroyed a dozen of them. Codebreakers in an English country house destroyed the rest. Rommel had known in his bones that the attack was bound to be an extremely difficult undertaking. He had said so in writing. He had been overruled. At dusk, with 52 tanks burning across the desert floor, Rommel called off the operation. 3 days later, the Desert Fox boarded a plane and flew north over the Mediterranean, away from Africa forever. The Afrika Korps did not know their commander had gone. On May 13, 1943, 68 days later, the last Axis soldier in North Africa laid down his weapons. More than 250,000 men went into captivity. Rommel was already in Germany reading about it from afar. The Battle of Medenine was not the largest battle of World War II, not the bloodiest. The Battle of Medenine lasted 1 day and cost the Allies fewer than 130 casualties. But on that 1 day, against an enemy who brought everything he had left, the British didn't even need to use their tanks.